Welcome to the TOEFL Listening section. In this section, you will listen to an academic lecture and then answer questions about what you heard. You may take notes while you listen. You will have time to review your notes before answering the questions. Listen to part of a lecture in a university class. You will hear the lecture only once, so listen carefully. After the lecture, you will answer some questions about what you heard. Some questions ask about the main ideas and supporting details. Other questions ask you to make inferences or connections between ideas. Answer each question based on what is stated or implied in the lecture.
Good morning, everyone. Today we will examine decision-making biases. We will look at common errors in human judgment and consider both their cognitive origins and practical consequences. When I say decision-making biases, I mean systematic deviations from rational choice that occur predictably across people. These are not random mistakes. They arise from heuristics that simplify complex problems and from emotional and social influences. One foundational set of findings comes from Tversky and Kahneman. Their experiments show that heuristics, such as availability and representativeness, produce predictable errors in probability judgment. For example, people often overestimate the frequency of dramatic events because such events are more mentally available. The availability heuristic explains why many people worry more about plane crashes than about car accidents, even though car travel is statistically more dangerous. Vividness in media coverage makes some risks more salient, and thus more likely to be recalled. Anchoring is another robust bias. Anchoring describes the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information encountered when making numerical estimates. If a courtroom offers an initial claim for damages, that number often sets a reference point for subsequent judgments. For example, a hiring committee may anchor on the first resume they see and rate all later candidates relative to it. That first impression becomes a cognitive anchor that is hard to fully adjust away. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out and overweight information that supports an existing belief while discounting contradictory evidence. This bias affects scientific interpretation and everyday reasoning about politics and health. Loss aversion is a motivational bias. People generally prefer avoiding losses to acquiring equivalent gains. This asymmetry helps explain why investors hold losing stocks too long and why people accept risky bets to avoid realizing a loss. The framing effect shows that the way choices are presented can change preferences even when the underlying outcomes are identical. Presenting treatment outcomes as survival rates versus mortality rates can flip patient preferences. Hindsight bias leads people to believe that past events were more predictable than they actually were. After an election, people often claim they knew the result all along. This bias undermines learning because it reduces the perceived need to analyze decisions carefully. Overconfidence is pervasive. Professionals, including doctors and financial analysts, frequently overestimate the accuracy of their judgments. This can lead to insufficient information search and excessive risk-taking. A useful way to think about these biases is to classify them by their cognitive mechanism. Some come from heuristics that speed processing, like availability and representativeness. Others come from motivational factors, such as loss aversion. Social influences produce biases like groupthink and status quo bias. We should consider real-world implications. In medicine, diagnostic errors can reflect anchoring on an initial diagnosis or availability driven by memorable cases. In finance, traders may show hurting because of social proof and overconfidence. Interventions to reduce bias fall into several categories. Training can improve awareness and statistical reasoning. Structured decision protocols, such as checklists, decision trees, and pre-commitment devices, can reduce reliance on faulty intuition. Organizational changes, like independent review and accountability, also help. Importantly, interventions must match the bias mechanism. For example, debiasing confirmation bias requires procedures that force consideration of disconfirming evidence. To mitigate anchoring, we can use blind estimates where initial anchors are hidden. I emphasize that awareness alone is not sufficient to eliminate bias, but structured decision protocols can reduce its impact. To conclude, decision-making biases are predictable and consequential. Understanding the cognitive causes and applying targeted interventions can improve judgment in medicine, law, business, and public policy. Next week, we will examine experimental designs used to quantify specific biases.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then, answer the question.
I emphasize that awareness alone is not sufficient to eliminate bias, but structured decision protocols can reduce its impact.
This concludes the listening section. For more TOEFL practice tests and study materials, visit Spinta.org.